What if this time the Iran nuclear deal really is dead? With fears that Tehran could be weeks away from a point of no return on its atomic ambitions, now comes the long held fear that Donald Trump's decision to walk away from the 2015 UN sponsored agreement could lead to an arms race in the Middle East. Already, Washington's weighing options that include yet tighter sanctions. What's the Biden administration's next move if the current round of talks in Vienna do indeed fail? Does the United States have the stomach for a fight this time? And is a fight what's unfolding? The same Gulf states that are cementing newfound ties with Israel are also keeping channels open with Tehran, what with the UAE reportedly facilitating financing for Iranian oil sales to China, the same UAE whose de facto leader, seen here with the visiting Israeli Prime Minister Monday, is staunchly opposed to Iran over Yemen. Confusing? Yes, it is. Another key to this puzzle is Iran's biggest rival, Saudi Arabia. Since Trump left the White House, its leader's been working to mend ties with other regional leaders like Qatar and has opened direct dialogue with Iran. How far will it go with the hardliners that are firmly in command in Tehran? That, too, an open question. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a nuclear deal that's on life support. And joining us, Annick Cizel, Associate Professor at Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
From Uppsala, Sweden, Rusbeh Parsi, the head of the Middle East North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.
And from Jerusalem, we're joined by Amos Asael, fellow at the Hartman Institute and senior commentator for the Jerusalem Post newspaper. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, they're into their third week of talks in Vienna. They seem to be going nowhere. European signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal, France, Germany, and the UK, putting out a statement lamenting Tehran's changing bargaining stance and its failure to get into substance. Without, quote, swift progress in light of Iran's fast forwarding of its nuclear program, the JCPOA, that's the name of the nuclear deal, will very soon become an empty shell, say those European nations. Iran's chief negotiator, Ali Bagheri Khani, responding in kind over Twitter, saying some actors persist in their blame game habit instead of real diplomacy. On a visit to Indonesia this Tuesday, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken talked of hoping for the best while preparing for the worst.
What we've seen so far is Iran losing precious time by advancing totally new positions that are inconsistent with a return to the JCPOA. We continue in this hour, on this day, to pursue diplomacy because it remains, at this moment, the best option, but we are actively engaging with allies and partners on alternatives.
Annick Cizel, what are the alternatives Antony Blinken's talking about?
Well, probably what's been discussed in Washington in the past few days, actually, when Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, was meeting with Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon and planning for contingencies, as the Americans will have it, just in case diplomacy does fail, both bilateral diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy, what the Biden administration has stepped back in now that the Trump administration has placed this country outside of the JCPOA, dealing possibly this final blow that the Europeans are referring to now, because time has gone by, because the Iranians have been pushing their uranium enrichment, taking advantage of the Trump hiatus, if I may call it this way. And in that sense, it's definitely diplomacy as last resort now in order to avoid an escalation, regional escalation that the United States partners in the Gulf, notably, are trying to avoid, are trying to build back some dialogue against such an escalation right now.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well, though, and I'll put it to you, Rusbeh Parsi, if The man that the U.S. Administration has been speaking to is the Israeli defense minister.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think a lot of this is genuine concern, but there is also a bit that's just posturing. And if you've been following this story long enough, as I and others like yourself probably have, you see that there is a repetition here. I mean, there's a sense of déjà vu. The Americans and the Israeli, all options are on the table. So therefore, the military option is there as a threat, as a looming threat. But in the end, the question is it really a viable option to solve this issue? I doubt that very much. So I think in that sense, I don't think Tehran particularly takes notice of the fact that it's defense ministers meeting.
How do you interpret what they're talking about here about alternatives? What are these alternatives they're talking about? Just more sanctions?
Well, that's the good question. I mean, how much and what else can the US do to Iran at this point? It's sanctioned Iran beyond what any country has ever been sanctioned. So yes, there might be a few things it can do, but we kind of reach sanctions fatigue and sanctions saturation. And if you're talking about a military option, it's kind of trendy among the DC bubble people to talk about strikes as if you can attack Iran with impunity and then they will kind of listen to you. I think it's been clear by now that the Iranians will not tolerate that. They're not Libya. They're not Iraq under Saddam Hussein. They're going to retaliate, and they've already shown that they can. And that's also one of the reasons why the Gulf countries are concerned that this might get out of hand, because they know that they will be on the front line of whatever countermeasures the Iranians are going to employ.
The Iran nuclear program going into fast forward, do we know exactly how much?
Well, I mean, they have more low enriched uranium than they're allowed to according to the agreement. And now they've enriched to 60%. But I think there again, we have to be kind of precise with what we're talking about. People are talking about breakout and that the breakout time has shortened. But that is the amount of high enriched uranium that Iran has at any given point. That does not a bomb make. You still need to have a trigger mechanism and you need to have a delivery system. So it's not like Iran is closer to an actual atomic bomb. It just means that it has the main component is closer at hand than it would be if it complied fully to the agreement.
Anik Cizel, you agree with Ruzbeh Parsi? We've seen this movie before.
Indeed, we have. But what we've seen also since, I guess, 2018 is a proxy war taking place between Iran and Israel in Syria. What we've seen is many strikes, generally from Israel onto Iranian military bases. But last October, it's the United States, it's a US base in southern Syria, which was struck by an Iranian drone. It seems that this sort of tit-for-tat escalation in Syria cannot leave the United States without at least planning for contingencies, which of course doesn't mean that they wish to go for it. What we've seen before as well is Israel pushing, to Israel, Iran even getting close to acquiring an atomic bomb is impossible. It's not in Israel's DNA. The Islamic Republic of Iran denies Israel its very existence. So Israel is not going to let it happen, come what may. And this diplomacy, this hardline diplomacy that we've been seeing these past few days in Washington, is also Israel seeking assurances from the United States that should they decide in Jerusalem to go for it, what is the United States response going to be? Is the US going to stand by its eternal ally since 1948? And what could be, if the United States tries to de-escalate in the region, what could be the linkage over other files which are currently not so much on the back burner? I'm thinking the Palestinian issue. Victoria Nuland, the number 3 in the State Department, who's in charge of that file, has been active on it as well. So most definitely the discussions are very heavy right now on many Middle East issues at the same time.
And let me ask you on that very point there, Anik Cizel. When you look at the current, you mentioned some of the big names inside of the U.S. administration currently. Do you get, is the Biden administration just a repeat of the Obama administration when it comes to the Iran nuclear program?
I don't think it can be because the context has changed so much. Because Donald Trump putting the United States out of the JCPOA, which his last Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recognized eventually that it was a strategic mistake. It's built up mistrust, distrust of the United States over the long term now. The Iranians know full well that unless they get, and this is what they're asking for now, guarantees, judicial guarantees, legal guarantees on the part of the United States that the next president of the United States will not get out of an agreement, should an agreement be possible today with the Biden administration. I mean, Tehran knows now how easy it is for the next president to pull out again. It's raised the stakes considerably and placed the initiative on the side of the Iranians today to dare the United States to come back to the table.
Amotz Asael, let me ask you, when you look at it now with hindsight, in light of what you just heard there from Anik Cizel, what do Israelis think? Was it the right thing for Donald Trump to quit the Iran nuclear deal? Amotz Asael, can you hear us? All right, we'll try to reconnect there with Jerusalem in a moment. The situation it has become more volatile in the last couple of years. At the same time, we've seen new alliances be forged. It's a photo op that would have been until very recently unthinkable. Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan hosting Israel's right-wing Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Up first, Peter O'Brien has that story.
Naftali Bennett has bidden farewell to a new friend, Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. After becoming the first ever Israeli head of state to visit the United Arab Emirates, Prime Minister Bennett said the two were setting an example of how to make peace in the Middle East.
Throughout the day, we had meaningful, in-depth, and straightforward talks about our two nations, about the region, and about our economy and technology and what we can do together.
After years of tension, a rapprochement between Israel and several Arab states, including the UAE, began last year under the US-mediated Abraham Accords. Commercial flights between the two countries have been operating since then, and earlier this year they opened respective embassies. This historic visit marks another step closer. The two leaders discussed further economic cooperation as Bennett looks to secure a free trade agreement next year. The issue of Iran was also likely discussed. It wasn't mentioned publicly by either of the two leaders, but Israel's ambassador had confirmed it was on the agenda. The two sides share concerns over Tehran's nuclear capabilities. Last month, Israel suggested setting up joint defenses with Gulf Arab states, while the UAE reached out to Iran last week, sending its senior national security advisor to meet with Iranian officials.
Okay, we do have the connection now with Jerusalem. Amotz Asael, a fellow at the Hartman Institute, senior commentator for the Jerusalem Post. Thanks for joining our discussion here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.
First of all, your reaction to the optics of Monday's visit of Israel's prime minister to the United Arab Emirates?
That is an epiphany for many of us here in Israel. It is heartening, and the most striking thing about it is how genuine the move appears to be on the part of the Emiratis, not only on the part of the government, but also on the part of the people.
Also on the part of the people, and what does it mean in terms of what we've been discussing about how the alliances seem to be perhaps shifting in the Middle East in the face of what looks like a dead end right now with these Iran nuclear talks.
Well, I wouldn't go to the extent of suggesting that the Emirates are now military allies with Israel. That would be far-flung, and there is no such expectation here in Jerusalem. The expectations here are that this will be mainly a commercial and diplomatic relationship, also cultural, but not military, not in terms of Israel's desires, but in terms of the UAE's abilities. Moreover, I think that just in my interpretation of what I'm witnessing, what the Emiratis are trying to be is different from what the Saudis are trying to be. The Saudis have been trying for decades to be, and in recent years have also managed to become, the leaders of the Arab world. The UAE has a different aim. I think its aim is, I'm saying this not based on information, only on impression. I think their aim is to be the Switzerland of the Middle East. They want to be the place that is safe for everyone to be in, that is on perfectly friendly terms with everyone in the neighborhood, and if possible, even with the Iranians.
And is that possible when they're at loggerheads over Yemen?
No, I don't think it's possible in the deeper sense of friendship. But it may be possible in the more shallow sense of non-belligerency. And from the Emirati viewpoint, I think it would be a great accomplishment if things should come to a head and there should be some exchange of blows between Iran and anyone else in the Middle East, that all this prospective violence be kept away from their shores. If I'm not mistaken, this is the Emirati quest.
All right, we'll see if that Emirati quest, as you portray it, will come to fruition. A U.S. delegation due this week in Abu Dhabi to warn Emirati banks against non-compliance with sanctions on Iran. It turns out that Chinese oil imports from the UAE fool no one. Their rise coincides with the drop to zero of direct crude exports by Tehran, which is once again under sanctions. We can show it with this graph here. Back in October, Esfandiar Batmangelijij wrote for his Bourse and Bazaar think tank blog how the recent growth in trade also suggests there's been a fundamental shift in attitudes of Emirati policy makers, no longer as afraid as before, Ruzbeh Parsi, to flout the interdict from Washington on doing business with Tehran.
Well, I think there are several things here. There's a confluence,
yes,
if you will. I mean,
Ruzbeh Parsi.
Sorry. I think, first of all, we have to remember that Dubai, for instance, which is part of UAE, has had a fairly good relationship and, more importantly, the most important economic linkage to Iran over time. And that has not disappeared totally, irrespective of sanctions or not. So this is basically just allowing that linkage to kind of grow again before having held it in hiatus, if you will. Then the other thing, of course, is that the UAE leadership understands that it needs to have a working relationship with Iran because it cannot rely on the US fully anymore for its security. And it knows that if the US goes off the reservation, as it were, in its confrontation with Iran, the UAE will feel the heat. So therefore, it's important to kind of not put all your eggs in a basket, in the same way that the UAE is buying arms from all over the place in order to not become dependent on one single source. So I think there is, if you will, a slight rethink, but how far it will go and when it will become more than just transactional and an attempt to blunt the edge of the confrontation, that is too early to tell.
Amos Asael saying a moment ago, Ruzbeh, how he doesn't believe that the cooperation between Israel and the Emirates will be a defense cooperation. The French news agency AFP, quoting Israeli industry sources, is saying, they're testing the waters about selling defense works, even though advanced anti-missile systems have yet to be offered. Do you think that it won't be a defense cooperation?
I think there might be. I think there already is when it comes to cyber issues. I think there might be on defensive arms procurement. But I think what would be the red line for the UAE itself, because it knows how that would be interpreted in Tehran, would be active military cooperation. Because that would put Israel on the doorstep of Iran, which would immediately raise the threat level in Tehran.
And that brings us to the question of how effective these U.S. sanctions are.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. This is one of the key things. And again, we've been doing this for more than 10 years. We would have exactly the same conversation in 2010, 2009, etc. U.S. sanctions have effect. The Trump sanctions have had a devastating effect on the Iranian economy. But for them to be effective, you have to relay them to what the objective is. And the objective was to get either the Iranian economy to implode and the government to be overthrown, or Iran coming running desperately, wanting to renegotiate the whole thing. That was Pompeo's, in a sense, gamble. It did not happen. It hasn't happened yet, even though the Biden administration is keeping all the Trump sanctions in place. So effect, very much so. The middle class in Iran has shrunk. The number of people under the poverty line has grown humongously, but it has not changed the policy and the politics of Tehran. So not effective.
And Xizel?
Well, those sanctions are shifting in, are piling up and shifting according to the Biden agenda as well. The Treasury Department on December 7th added 2 rounds of sanctions on some Iranians, according to the agenda of the Summit for Democracy that was held at the end of last week. That is against any country or any entity, actually, that contributes to corruption and repression, and entities that undermine, quote unquote, undermine democracy. Meaning that the agenda, which is the spearhead, actually, of the Biden administration, restoring global leadership, U.S. global leadership on human rights and democracy, civil rights, no corruption, which is a big effort being carried out right now jointly by Janet Yellen at the Treasury Department and Samantha Power at the United States Agency for International Development. And this agenda is being targeted primarily at Iran, of course, not just Iran, but notably at Iran, which became, again, a target just on the eve of.
But again, I get back to what we were talking about a moment ago, which was, the Emiratis who are facilitating these sales of Iranian oil to China.
Well, and at the same time, there were rumors among the American press that South Korea was unfreezing some assets, some money for the Iranians as well. Now, of course, I mean, especially in these days of globalization, U.S. allies and partners are free to do what they wish. But questions were raised, actually, during a press conference given by Ned Price on behalf of the State Department just before the weekend. Questions were asked by the American press as to what extent the U.S. administration was currently sort of posturing, as one of your other guests was saying earlier, posturing very tough, at the same time as relinquishing a little bit on the leash, okay, towards Iran to get the talks going. Keeping in mind as well that last week was a busy week, and that the 2-hour something phone call between President Joe Biden, and President Vladimir Putin most definitely did not just talk about Ukraine, but most likely Iran was also on the agenda. And same thing, whatever dialogue exists between Washington and Beijing right now. And the larger framework is one of diplomacy where every single one of the P5+1, the signatories to the JCPOA, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council in Germany, it's everybody's interest to bring Iran back around the table to some form of nuclear de-escalation, also in preparation, not just for some form of great power dialogue diplomacy agenda, at the same time as Ukraine and Taiwan are definitely escalating the tensions around Washington, but also because next January, if I'm not mistaken, the Non-Proliferation Treaty shall undergo another revision, which is on the table. And if there's one piece of dialogue which is still going on between at least Russia and the United States, China is a different story. Let's not forget that last February, President Biden signed the extension of the New START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The New START treaty signed under Obama by President Obama, President Medvedev at the time in 2010, was prolonged by Biden and Putin this time for another 5 years, I believe. So nuclear non-proliferation, generally speaking, regionally in the Middle East and globally is on the table, and a lot of pressure could be exercised, diplomatic pressure could be exercised from all sides, therefore, on Iran right now.
Okay, so the diplomatic channels are open, Amos Asael. I know there were hearty cheers when Donald Trump walked away from the Iran nuclear deal. Today in Jerusalem, what's the perception? That it's better that all sides sit down and talk, or that this is a fruitless exercise that amounts to nothing anyway?
Well, first of all, right now I think there is a consensus in Israel that Donald Trump's retreat from the deal with Iran was reckless, that it was a shot from the hip with no plan for what happens the morning after, much the way, by the way, he dealt with North Korea. It was a pattern, and we're not here to discuss Trump, but this is how that move of his is seen in Israel, even by those whose hawkishness made them basically applaud that move, as you rightly recall. So that's in terms of what happened then. In terms of what is happening now, what needs to be borne in mind is that so much time has elapsed in the interim, and that the regime in Iran has somewhat changed at the time, and for the worse, a scenario that back then few people thought could happen, but it did happen. And this particular administration in Tehran is perceived in Israel as a total non-starter for any kind of deal. There is no sense of pragmatism over there that anyone here is managing to detect. So everyone is following very closely what is happening there, but the general feeling is that this is sort of like negotiating the Sudetenland with Nazi Germany. Instead of negotiating with it, it's very ideological engine. And this is, I think, how Israelis generally view the talks right now taking place concerning Iran's nuclear program. No one here thinks that this can deliver any kind of salvation. That is why I think Israeli policymakers have no serious difference on this. Netanyahu, Bennett, and even the left in the Israeli parliament.
But aren't there people? Amos, excuse me, Amos. Let me ask you on this, because aren't there people in Israel who perhaps take the counterintuitive view? You know, like it took a right-wing hardliner in Israel to negotiate peace with Egypt. That you need a hawk to make peace.
From Israel's side, perhaps, but from the Iranian side, we don't see that interlocutor. Surely they have the clout, if that's what you're asking. Yes, and a regime as extremist as the current Iranian regime is indeed in a position to strike a deal someday with Israel. Sure, they are in a position to do that, but there is no indication that this is their inclination, and we certainly cannot assume that this is a prospect. So we take it as a given that they are what we currently see that they are. And the question is where everyone is striving after this. And I think that there is one thing here that probably moves the Americans and some of the Europeans. And it is there's wisdom in it. If I'm not mistaken, their longer-term strategic hope is to keep this dynamic of dialogue somehow simmering for years until the post-Khamenei era dawns. And that, him being in his mid-80s and reportedly not well, might take a few years, might take more, nobody knows, it's anyone's guess. But the assumption that he is in the Iranian scene, some kind of a Brezhnev in the former Soviet scene, that is a fair analogy. And what the West did with Brezhnev was not to make believe that he is already Gorbachev. They waited wisely and patiently for Gorbachev to come and replace him. Not that anyone foresaw it back then, but in hindsight we can say that dealing with them the way the West did back in the 70s and in the 80s, with the strategic, long-term, historic, ideological patience, paid. And I think some of this is now at play with the American attitude towards Iran.
Rouzbeh Parsi, is that a correct reading of Iran, where even though you've just had a presidential election, it's actually a lame duck leadership, what with the supreme leader now aged?
No, with all due respect, I find it fascinating that no matter who gets elected to anything in Iran, it's always considered to be a supervillain ideological regime that you can't deal with. That was exactly what the Rouhani administration was considered to be. There was no point in negotiating with them. They would never reach a deal, etc., etc. They did reach a deal. And as long as the US was in the agreement, they honored that deal. What happened now is that you reap what you sow. The Trump administration undercut anyone with any political standing in Tehran who argued that you could agree on something with the US and the Americans would deliver. You can't sell that in Tehran now. And that's one of the reasons, one of the very contributing factors that we have the president we have in Iran at the moment. And yes, this is a much more hardline government, but that is partly at least because of the way the Trump administration undercut the whole idea that you could come to an agreement with the West. And these guys are much tougher to sell any agreement to, absolutely. Is it impossible? No. Are they necessarily super ideological when it comes to these negotiations? Not necessarily. They might be super ideological on Israel to some degree, but that is not what's being negotiated. What is negotiated now, as was before, is how do you constrict and confine the Iranian nuclear enrichment program, which Bibi Netanyahu was against from the very beginning. He went to US Congress without telling the American president and said, you should not sign this deal. So the Israeli establishment was against it from the beginning, except for some exceptions in the military establishment who were much more clear-eyed because they were not as ideological. And then the Trump administration did what Netanyahu wanted all along. He left the deal. And now we're stuck with a nuclear program that is much less under control and much less constricted.
Okay, so Rouzbeh Parsi, the way you paint this picture, it's a more volatile Middle East than it was back in 2015. Iran is inching closer to having that capability of getting the bomb, and yet we have, since the month of August, these direct talks taking place between Iran and its arch rival, Saudi Arabia. They're brokered by Iraq. We've have this timid thaw, if you will, that's taking place between MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and the leadership in Tehran. What's that about?
Well, again, I think it's about the fact that both sides have recognized that they actually need to talk directly to each other. The Saudis thought that they could basically just push the Americans in front of them to kind of contain the Iranians. And the Iranians, who have been and are still to some degree very arrogant when it comes to their relationships with the Arab world, especially the Gulf countries, they basically thought that the Saudis would do whatever the Americans told them to do. So if you could just agree with the Americans, you could continuously ignore the Saudis. I think both sides have understood that they are permanent neighbors and they cannot afford that kind of arrogance. So the Iranians understand that they need to have some kind of regional dialogue, bilateral, but nonetheless. And the Saudis have understood that they cannot expect the Americans to bail them out, especially if the confrontation is between the US and Iran. And then the Saudis would not even be at the table when the confrontation happens. They would just have to pay the price for it. So therefore, they're trying to kind of preempt that by having their own dialogue with Iran. And it's important to understand that what's happening in Vienna is happening parallel to this. For the Americans, and this is the reason they're sending people around now to kind of get the banks back in order, is they don't want this regional thaw to go too far before they have managed to, what they think at least, is to force the Iranians to a compromise in Vienna. So they welcome it, but they don't want it to go out of hand, as it were, as far as they themselves are concerned.
This is key, because let me put it to Anik Cizel. America still remains the predominant superpower in the world. Yet, if it has crises at the same time as in Taiwan, in Ukraine, and over Iran's nuclear program, can it fire on all cylinders?
Obviously not. And this is, you've perfectly synthesized what's at stake right now. This is why I really think that last week was just a wonderful week, because the three threats emerged at the very same time. And definitely, this is not an option, which is why I was insisting on this sort of paradox that at a time when tensions are reaching the recent highest, between the United States and Russia on one side and the United States and China on the other side, Iran may very paradoxically, very ironically, be a window for diplomacy between the three greatest among the great powers of the world we live in now. And also show the U.S. capacity to implement, to operationalize what it's been trying to do ever since Barack Obama, that is regionalize the issues of the Middle East and share the political responsibility with notably the Gulf Cooperation Council, with the great powers in the region, and place them in a situation when they start their own diplomacy with Iran and shoulder the political burden at the same time as the United States wraps up not just Afghanistan, but the Prime Minister of Iraq was being the spokesperson for Washington, saying just before the weekend, announcing that the war against ISIS and the U.S. troops deployed in Iraq in that war against ISIS was now over as well. As far as I know, the U.S. troops are remaining in Iraq right now and are not being pulled back. Still haven't read anything. I don't know about if anybody else on the set has read anything about this. It seems the U.S. troops are not being brought back home. Actually, everyone from General Mark Milley, at the head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the general who heads the CENTCOM for the United States right now, everyone had gone public. Everyone in the U.S. military establishment had gone public before the announcement by the Iraqi prime minister saying we don't want the troops to come back home.
Yeah, they don't want to cede the ground, and it's in part with an eye towards Iran. We're out of time. Amos Asael, just in 30 seconds, does the United States right now, can it keep its eye on the ball in the Middle East when it's got these crises elsewhere?
Yes, diplomatically, this is what makes a superpower. It needs to work simultaneously on very distant arenas. Militarily, of course, no superpower should fight, even superpowers shouldn't fight simultaneously on two fronts, as America learned the hard way in recent decades. But this is not about military confrontation from America's viewpoint. It's about diplomatic resolve, and I think it can display it simultaneously in multiple arenas.
Amos Asael, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Ruzbe Parsi in Uppsala. Anik Cizel, we want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.